There is very little recorded early history of Tuscarora. Brushville, as it was originally called, bushy-type vegetation with very few trees of any size, it was later changed to Tuscarora. It is thought to be named for an Indian tribe from North Carolina who fled to New York State after losing many battles with the settlers and joined the Five Nations of the Iroquois, making it the Sixth Nation. The Tuscarora tract, as it was known, was bought by a Luke Tierman from Baltimore. He did very little to settle it, and it was eventually seized by squatters who did little to settle or develop the lands, interested only in hunting, fishing, and trapping. In 1806 or 7, Jason Scott, along with 2 or 3 others, paddled up the Tuscarora Creek looking for land to buy. They noticed that the leaves and nuts on the hazelnut trees had all turned black, which meant that they had early and late frosts. They decided not to buy any land. They spent the night in a half-built hut on the banks of the Tuscarora between Brushville and Nunday. At that time there was only one occupied house between the two towns, and that was by a squatter. In 1822, Tierman appointed a Charles Carroll, later to become Judge Carroll, who became quite well known in this valley as his sales agent. Carroll sold many tracts of land, but, sorry to say, very few made the second payment, and most of them immigrated west. The first permanent resident was a Dan Sedan. In 1823, he bought 75 acres, and after paying for his land, had but $60 left to build a house for he and his wife. In 1831, the first deed for land was issued to a David Babcock. There were many others to follow. The first fulling mill was built in 1826 by a J.P. Dodge. In 1830, he built a carding mill, and a few years later, a sawmill. In 1830, the first frame dwelling was built by a Mr. Northway. Some of the very early settlers were Bowers, Wheelock, Damon, Petrie, Conklin, Crevelin, LaRue, Dodge, Bevere, Hall, Rittenhouse, Slate, Van Osdale. The first school was organized in 1830 and was known as District 13. The first recorded number of pupils was in 1835 with 126. The school teacher's salary being $127.42 for 11 months and 3 days. In 1840, because of the amount of attendance, the district was divided between Tuscarora and Nunday. The children on the southeast side of the creek going to Nunday, and those on the northwest side remaining in Tuscarora. The Presbyterian Church was organized in 1839 with 11 members. The church was built in 1844, and William Harmon being its first pastor. The bell was a gift of a David LaRue, who in his will left $500 for a bell. It was dedicated in 1877 with a lawn picnic and services. The first Catholic services for Mount Morris and vicinity were held on the top of North Hill during the building of the canal. This was known as the Slate property, later becoming the Sibley property. Services ceased when the canal was abandoned. The building later burned. The first physician was a J. Robinson. In the early years and during the operating of the canal, Tuscarora had 2 to 3 doctors at any given time. The first survey for the canal was in 1834. In 1840, it was completed from Rochester to Mount Morris. In 1841, from Mount Morris to Dansville. In 1851, from the Shaker settlement, which is now Saguenay, to Oramel. From Rochester to Olean in 1856. There was 118 miles at a cost of $6 million. The first cheese factory was built in 1877. At the height of its prosperity, it was receiving 6,000 pounds of milk a day. When the price of cheese dropped, the factory was abandoned. Later, a second one was built and operated for 11 years. In 1826, the first tavern was built. This was the backside of what was later to become the Tuscarora House. In 1841, the LaRue brothers bought the tavern and built the Tuscarora Hotel in front of it. At one time, there were 3 hotels operating in Tuscarora. The Tuscarora House, one on property that was later to become Jack and Gertie Lee's house, and the one at the bottom of North Hill, which was later turned into a residence, and is the only one still standing. The construction of the canal demanded a large workforce, and businesses and boarding houses flourished. Because of this descent between Tuscarora and Saguenay, a number of locks were needed. These cost the state $10,000 apiece. These locks had to be tended, and many of the tenders lived on the canal between Tuscarora and Saguenay. I talked to one of the old-timers at one time, and he told me that he remembers as a boy his grandfather, who was in the logging business, rafting the logs together and then tying a wagon on top, and the team would pull the whole thing to Rochester, where he would sell his lumber and then drive the horse and buggy back to Tuscarora. After the opening of the canal, it is said that Tuscarora excelled Mount Morris as a business district. During the latter part of the operation of the canal and before its closing, a diphtheria epidemic hit Tuscarora. Sometimes completely wiping out a family. Some of these who have been buried in the back part of the Dutch Street Cemetery. With the closing of the canal, it left Tuscarora without an adequate shipping and transportation. Everything brought in to Tuscarora had to be by wagon and taken out by wagon, until the railroad came through a few years later. In the meantime, many businesses folded and merchants moved to nearby towns. As of 1908, there was a church, a cheese factory, a grist mill, a hotel, 2 stores, a meat market, 2 warehouses, and 2 blacksmith shops. Today, as of 1990, we have the Presbyterian Church, a grocery store, and a tavern, and no old-timer to sit and reminisce on the good old days.